Good morning, everyone. We're welcome back again to class today. Today we're going to be progressing on to chapter 2, which is titled The Spread of Civilization. In this chapter, we're going to look at how civilization, and remember that word civilization is a group of people living and working together with a structure, not just the spread of peoples like in a nomadic way. We're going to look at how civilizations actually spread. All right, so this is our chapter introduction. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at civilizations in Egypt, Eastern Mediterranean, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and South America. So we're going to look at how civilizations have spread about the world in this early period of time, and some of the similarities and definitely some of the differences that they'll have. All right, this is a story matters. What we have right here is we have a face, a plaster or clay carving of a face of Sestorius III. He was a pharaoh who ruled Egypt during the Middle Kingdom. So let's look at our essential questions, okay? Well, before we get there, our period of time is circa 3100 BC up to 200 BC. So we're actually getting closer towards modern times. One thing about our book is a lot of times it doesn't do things chronologically. A lot of times it groups things ideologically, meaning of the same ideals. So you started in chapter 1 with the rise of civilization. Now we're coming into the spread of civilization some thousands of years later. Let's look at our central questions for the chapter. How does geography affect the development of civilizations? So we're going to talk about land formations, rivers, mountains, climate falls into that geography effect. And how does that affect the development of civilizations? And in what ways do civilizations influence each other? As we talked about a little bit in chapter 1, trade became big, and we'll get to see how interacting with different civilizations influences the other. So here's our story matters. First developed in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the key elements of civilization, including cities, government, economies, organized religion, and writing systems, also emerged in other river valleys in Egypt, India, and China. While its fertile soil and natural barriers to invasion, with its fertile soil and natural barriers to invasion, Egypt developed a strong civilization, exhibited in its massive cultural achievements, such as the pyramids. Its rulers, known as pharaohs, were worshipped as gods. So my first question to you is this. What are some qualities that a pharaoh might have needed to rule Egypt? All right, so a pharaoh is a supreme being. Okay, you have to understand what a pharaoh is. It's bigger than being the president. The pharaoh was also believed to have been a deity, a god of sorts. So what are some qualities that a pharaoh might have needed to rule Egypt? Pause the presentation and we'll talk about it when you get back. Some of the answers that you might have had, well, they would have had to be intelligent. They would have had to have been decisive, making good decisions. They would have had to have been shrewd, meaning that they could understand the different players in the game and the people around them, people who might have been trying to harm them, go against their interests, and people who were truly working for them. They would have had to have a strong personality and, of course, mental toughness. So what does this fragment of a sculpture tell us about the pharaoh? Well, we do see that the portrait is realistic rather than idolized. So this is an actual ancient sculpting portrait of what the pharaoh looked like then, as opposed to making him more or less than what he actually was by idolizing him. What we're going to do now is we're going to analyze a primary source. Remember, a primary source is something that is directly related to the historical topic that we're trying to investigate. Let me read this first to you. Along with the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia, civilization spread throughout the Mediterranean world, Asia, and the Americas. Egypt emerged along the Nile River, developing into a vast empire that had a largely stable monarchy, religion, languages, writing systems, and artistic tradition. The Phoenicians, Hittites, and Israelites developed languages and extensive trade networks in the Mediterranean. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa fostered a flourishing early Indian culture, governed by a succession of great dynasties. China developed cities along the Yellow River. Civilization later spread into Central and South America, where the Olmec, Zapotec, and Chauvin peoples formed and built cities. So this is just an overview of how civilization has spread across the world in whole. And notice that they're all, again, spreading towards these river valleys or along the Yellow River, different areas along the Nile River. And so we're going to see that. Well, you can take a second and read that over again so you can get an idea of it. And then we're going to move on to our primary sources. Okay, so let's analyze a secondary source. A secondary source is something that someone else has written as their historical review of a time period. All right, so what we're looking at right here is a quote from Paul Johnson from The Civilization of Ancient Egypt that he wrote in 1999. At one time, scholars believed that the civilization of ancient Egypt was the first in the history of the world and the progenitor of all others. So at one point in time, historians believed that all civilizations started in Egypt and that all other civilizations kind of grew from that. But what they found out later was that they were wrong about that. We now know this to be untrue, but the ancient Egyptians retained one unique distinction. Even though they weren't the first civilization, they came out of it with one thing that no one else had. They were the first to do. And they were the first people on earth to create a nation state. Remember in the last chapter, we talked about city states. It'd be the equivalent of Knoxville, Nashville, Chattanooga, Memphis, all being able to operate under their own control, having their own currency, their own leaders and rulers, their own laws and government. Well, that does make for a very fractured group of different city states. Instead, what you see the Egyptians do is they unite all these different cities under one flag, just like all of our major cities and all of our cities and counties are all united under the Tennessee state flag. All of our states are united under the United States flag. And so that creates this framework. As you read on, it says they were the first people on earth to create a nation state. This nation state served as the framework of a culture of extraordinary strength, assurance, and durability, which lasted for 3,000 years and retained almost to the end its own unmistakable purity of style. So they laid out the framework, the blueprint for how to create a nation such as our own that could last for a long time, having one currency, one overall central government with smaller governing bodies to keep things in check. This framework is what the Egyptians basically give to history in one aspect. So now let's answer a question. How were the contributions of the Egyptians and the Phoenicians models for a successful civilization? Pause the presentation, write your answer down in your notebook. This is for your own good. It's not for a grade, but it's for something that you want to put in your notebook for you to study later. Write that down, and we'll talk about it when we come back. Okay, our question is, how were the contributions of the Egyptians and the Phoenicians models for a successful civilization? Okay, so here is what we've got from that. The model that they got is the central government, such as that created by the Egyptians. They also had one written language that unified their state. The Phoenicians created this language that the Phoenicians created. It was a vital characteristic for a stable and successful civilization. You may have some different ideals, but those are some of the main ideals that you ought to draw from that. Here's our secondary source that we're going to take a look at. It's from a man named Sabatino Moscati, written in a book called From the World of the Phoenicians in the year 1965. One of the greatest, if not the greatest glory of the Phoenicians was the spread of the alphabet in the Mediterranean area. There is no doubt that the Phoenicians taught the alphabet to the Greeks, nor that the Phoenicians and Greeks were responsible for spreading it in the West. This is certain and gives the Phoenicians an important role in the history of civilization. So this is huge because we're no longer reading from a picture that represents just one ideal. Think about that. Think about how many different pictures you would have to represent every single ideal, every single object in your daily life. It's kind of a fun concept now to speak in emojis, but imagine if you had to hold complete conversations only in emojis. And that's basically what ideograms were. Now we're talking about letters that represent the verbiage, that represent the sounds that come out of the actual human mouth. And now those letters can be arranged in multiple ways and fashions to represent every ideal, every word that is in the vocabulary of said people's language. So here's our question that we want to ask. What role did Phoenician traders play in transmitting Phoenician culture? Take a look again at our secondary source, Pause the presentation, read over it, write the answer in your notebook. Again, this is strictly for you. It's not for a grade. It's a good study material. Pause it now and have an answer when we get back. Okay, our question is, what role did Phoenician traders play in transmitting Phoenician culture? Well, their answers may vary, but they'll probably include that Phoenician merchants introduced the Phoenician alphabet to other countries, such as Greece, in the process of conducting trade. So again, trade goes interlocks our cultures, has them intermingle. If we go back, take this backwards, trade is not possible if it isn't for a surplus of goods. A surplus of goods is not possible if it's not for systematic agriculture. Systematic agriculture is not possible if it wasn't for the domestication of plants and animals and being able to settle down from a nomadic lifestyle. So this is just an exponential growth from this one little ideal of settling down and no longer being a nomad to now it's spreading to different cultures throughout the world. Now let's take a look at a map here of early civilization, circa 3000 to 200 BC, in the time period that we're studying. This map is actually a video that that's gonna play for you here in just a second. And on the left are 4 questions that you want to be aware of as you go through the video.
A number of regions are identified as culture hearths. Most are river valleys, including the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers known as Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley, the Indus River Valley, and the Huanghe Valley. Another culture hearth is the long, narrow region of Mesoamerica. The earliest culture hearth, Mesopotamia, produced such innovations as the first cities, writing systems, and legal codes. Beginning with Sumer, a long series of related civilizations rose and fell within Mesopotamia. Developing at about the same time as Mesopotamia, the culture hearth of the Nile River Valley also produced a writing system in cities. Although interrupted by periods of social disorder and foreign invasion, the sequence of Egypt's Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms still created a cultural continuity. Through long-distance trade, another characteristic of culture hearths, Egypt also influenced the development of such regions as Kush to the south. Long-distance trade was also a feature of the culture hearth that developed in Indus River Valley. The Harappan civilization that arose in this region participated in long-distance trade and shared cultural influences with both Mesopotamia and Egypt. The last of the great river valley civilizations to develop was that of the Huanghe in northern China. This culture hearth, which produced cities, metalworking, and a writing system, would be the center of the long series of Chinese dynasties beginning with the Shang and Zhou. Developing later than the old world culture hearths, Mesoamerica produced many of the same innovations, including cities, stratified societies, and writing systems. Beginning with the Olmec, a series of related civilizations developed in Mesoamerica, including the Zapotec, Maya, and Aztec, that shared cultural features such as pyramid architecture and a ritual ball game.
That's not your bell. Stay seated. So what you're going to do now is answer those 4 questions on the left side of the page here. Write those again down in your notebooks. This is for your own good for testing and studying purposes. So if you're following along in your book with the introduction, this is the step into the time. This is our timeline that we find on page 20. This is to get us oriented to understanding where we are in a worldview in a chronological manner. We've already looked at where we are geographically and where we are in the way of ideals with governments and nation states. Now let's look at where we are on a timeline. This is a good skill to have, is understanding how to read a timeline. So our first question we want to find an answer to is, in what year did the Olmec civilization emerge in Mesoamerica? Take a few seconds, pause the presentation, and we'll discuss it when we get back. Our question is, in what year did the Olmec civilization emerge in Mesoamerica? The answer to that is 1200 BC. So if you're looking at that on the timeline, it's sandwiched in between the Egyptian Middle Kingdom begins and King Saul establishes the Kingdom of Israel. Our next question, I just kind of gave it away. Which came first, the Egyptian Old Kingdom or the brief introduction of monotheism in Egypt? Take a few seconds, pause the presentation, and we'll discuss it when we get back. Okay, so the Egyptian Old Kingdom was established in the year 2700 BC. The brief introduction of monotheism by Pharaoh Akhenaten was done in 1350 BC. Now, that's, like I said, that's backwards from the way we do our years today. 2700 BC would be further away when we talk about moving backwards on a timeline. 1350 is closer to us, so it happened not as far long ago as the Egyptian Old Kingdom beginning. And our last question is, when was the Great Pyramid at Giza constructed? The Great Pyramid of Giza was constructed in 2540 BC, so roughly 160 years after the establishment of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. Now that we're at the end of the chapter 2 introduction, we've seen the place and the time. We've looked at geography. We looked at how they set their country up from a governmental standpoint. We've also looked at the chronology of everything, where we are in the world as a whole in a manner of on the timeline. So now let's review the things we've talked about and look forward to what we're going to discover in chapter 2. Along with the rise of civilization in Mesopotamia, civilizations spread throughout the Mediterranean world, Asia, and the Americas. Egyptians retained one unique distinction. They were the first people on earth to create a nation state. This state served as the framework of a culture of extraordinary strength. And one of the greatest, if not the greatest, glory of the Phoenicians was the spread of the alphabet in the Mediterranean area. So now don't forget, do some reading tonight. Of course, you'll get your 10 minutes of silent reading in class tomorrow, but do some reading tonight. It's always good to get ahead. Remember that you have a vocab quiz tomorrow, first thing when we come in. That's always the first thing we have. If you have any questions, you can always look at the Q&A message board. And while you're on Moodle, be sure to get on there and answer your discussion questions that will run the length of the chapter. Always do those things. Get everything turned in on time. Be safe. I'll see you guys tomorrow.